All right, so I said let's dig into paradise. You've admitted that the original conceivers of this idea didn't leave us with a playbook. Dang it. So what does it look like? You'd
Mhm.
mentioned someone that you'd worked with who, was kind of being held to this. Hey, we really need to be thoughtful about retention right now. So you've got that on your mind. You're a little bit concerned about retaining all your good talent. At the same time, maybe you're seeing some slips in performance. What does a conversation that has high accountability, high empathy, being communicated to another, what does that sound like? If I'm that
Yeah. What?
employee who you want to keep, Ed, you don't want to lose me, and yet I'm not quite stepping up. And
Mhm.
I've got some stuff going on. There's a lot on my plate. Maybe I've got some personal things that I've been vulnerable with and shared with you about. What do you say to me?
Yeah. Well, first it starts with a leader's self-awareness, right? If a leader isn't able, if a leader isn't on a regular basis kind of stepping back to understand how they tend to behave in these kinds of circumstances, what their strengths and weaknesses are, what steps they might take to address those weaknesses, and how they might compensate for those weaknesses, then they're going to go into conversations like this sort of flying blind without a real
Mm.
awareness of the impact that they have on the other person. I mean, that is one of the primary functions of coaching, is really just helping the leader kind of step back and say, like, how do I operate in these kinds of circumstances? What's my philosophy of leadership? How does that manifest itself? What kinds of feelings tend to come up in conversations like this, and how do I behave as a result? What's the impact on other people? Can I draw some conclusions based on conversations that have gone well or badly, based on relationships that have gone well or badly? Also, like hey, what's the best time to plant a tree? Today and 20 years ago, right? Same thing. What's the best time to have to build a functional working relationship? Well, today we can take some steps by having this kind of conversation, but it also starts with, well, when did you begin working together, and
Mm.
how did you begin that relationship? A lot of my work with leaders involves understanding, how are you onboarding an executive? How are you initiating that relationship? Do you start by building some trust, by extending
Mm.
some empathy toward them, by being able to make it a relationship in which it's safe to be vulnerable? Do you express an interest in what's going on for them personally, while simultaneously, are you from the start, from the jump, holding them accountable? Are you clarifying who's going to do what by when, to what standard of quality? Or are you deferring that? So I think it's not just about, well, what's the conversation? How do I have this conversation today? It's also looking back on the history of all of your working relationships. How are you starting those relationships, and are you laying the foundation? Because it's so much easier to have this sort of high accountability, high empathy culture in a relationship, on a team, in an organization, if that's your intention from the start. And so,
Mm.
first, just kind of getting a sense, what's my philosophy of leadership? How do I tend to behave in these circumstances? And am I showing up from the get-go in all of these settings in a way where I'm doing both? Because if I have to make some radical course correction, it's going to be harder. And
Yeah.
yet sometimes we do have to do that. We do have to make a change in that. An initial way to approach every one of these conversations, I would say, is with inquiry. A lot of times leaders come in to a conversation with somebody who's underperforming, and they're kind of, and again, they tend towards one or the other. They assume, oh well, I just have to kind of pat somebody on the shoulder and say they're there, or I have to kind of come in hot. And occasionally that's a conversation is going to take one or the other route. I'm not suggesting that you gotta kind of that you're always precluded from having that kind of conversation. But beginning a conversation with inquiry, just by understanding a little bit more about what's going on,
Mm.
what's when somebody, one of the things you asked me to reflect on, Brenda, was a high performer whose performance has slipped somehow. And that's certainly a theme that comes up in my work with clients. And one of the things I always ask them is, what do you know about what's going on in their life?
Yeah.
Is something going on in their life outside of work, especially, if this is a habitual high performer. And so beginning with inquiry and saying, hey, what is going on in your life? Is there something that might be affecting your ability to perform? However, note, that shouldn't just come out of left field. If you haven't built a relationship, if you don't have a
Mm.
culture in which it's safe, normal to talk about personal issues, about things that might be coming outside of work, the person's going to be a little, shocked or surprised. Wait, why are you
Right.
asking me what's going on in my life? So there's no cookie cutter way to approach this, but I do think by starting with a sense of self-awareness, who am I as a leader? How do I
Mhm.
tend to show up? What's my philosophy of leadership? How does it manifest itself in these kinds of situations? And am I getting the results I want? Because in some cases, like maybe I'm holding people accountable and boy, we've got results, but oh wow, people seem a little anxious around me, or
Mm.
I lose some people because they don't necessarily feel like I'm interested in their personal growth and development. Or conversely, wow, I've got such warm relationships with people. Everybody appreciates, how much I care for them as a leader. And yet, our results are habitually, disappointing. I
Right.
think just starting with what's your approach to leadership and how is it showing up in either of those ways?
That's great. Thank you.